You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bortz as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Rachel Land. The words trauma and trauma-informed yoga have made their way into popular use recently. Many of us, I suspect, don't know exactly what they mean, but the incidence of clinically significant trauma is high enough that chances are some of the individuals that we are teaching or practicing with have been impacted by it. In fact, up to 90% of us will be exposed to some level of traumatic stress during the course of our lives. And that could be a natural disaster, a severe accident, physical or other abuse, right the way through to a war, refugee crises, or even a global pandemic. Not everyone who's exposed to trauma goes on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, but it's still something we should all know a little more about. Today's guest is Dr. Anne Bortz, a licensed clinical psychologist with almost 30 years of experience in the field, whose specialty is working with those impacted by trauma. In today's conversation, she helps us understand what trauma is, who it most commonly affects, how it changes the body and brain, and what yoga practices can help. So let's dive in to my conversation with Dr. Anne Bortz. Welcome, Dr. Anne Bortz, to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us today.
I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
I'm happy to have you. I've been diving into the yoga medicine training, mindful trauma-informed yoga, and it's been just fascinating for me. I think I'd been operating under the assumption that I didn't work with anyone who'd experienced trauma, but the statistics that you shared suggest that that's probably not the case. And hopefully we'll get there through the course of the conversation. But if you don't mind, let's start with a little of your professional background. I'm fascinated to know what initially drew you to clinical psychology.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I actually, growing up, some people that were really dear to me had histories of trauma. And I so wished that I could have been helpful to them. And clearly, as a child, as an adolescent, I couldn't be. But I think that really drove my desire to work in psychology and to learn a lot more about trauma specifically.
So your specialty in working with people with trauma was there right from the beginning. That was part of that initial drive.
It was.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that when I think about that kind of work, it sounds to me like a really heavy burden to carry to help people who've been through experiences that challenging and that horrific. And I know you mentioned in the training that people who work with those who've experienced trauma can start to have their own vicarious experience of trauma in their own tissues just from the things that they've heard. Is that how yoga came into the picture for you to help support you through your professional work?
It is. It is actually. You know what I realized, and my first job was working with little traumatized girls who were in residential care from the ages about 6 to 12 who had really chronic histories of sexual and physical abuse. And so I was working with them and really realizing, wow, verbal interventions alone aren't getting the job done for these girls. And I also noticed that my insights were starting to mirror theirs. And so I was really starting to experience a lot of arousal dysregulation myself, frequently feeling really quite hyper aroused and having a lot of kind of intrusive imagery that I had been taking in. I would I would be seeing it at other times during my day. And then I was looking for ways to really soothe, ground, regulate myself. And I just kind of stumbled into yoga. I wasn't really thinking this was going to be the thing, but I was really struck by how different I felt when I practiced and how helpful it was to me. I felt like, oh, this is giving me the tools to really recognize and respond to what I was encountering. And then realizing it might be a really helpful tool for the people I was working with to also have.
So that's, I'm guessing, what inspired you to go from yoga student to yoga teacher and to do a training so that you had the tools to pass the skills on.
Exactly. Yes.
Did you feel that you needed to do a trauma sensitive yoga teacher training? Were they even around when you started teaching, or did you have that side of it already from your professional expertise?
They didn't even have those kinds of trainings back when I did that. Yeah, back at the time when I was starting to think about this as an intervention, Bessel van der Kolk was just starting to do some of his studies at the same time. And so as a psychologist, I was attending some of his seminars on some of the work he was doing, but none of it had been published yet. And, Emerson, the yoga teacher he was working with, hadn't started doing his trainings yet. So that wasn't really something that was available. I was so grateful to my first yoga teacher who just encouraged me. She said, if not you, who? When I said I was thinking about trying to deliver some trauma-informed yoga to some traumatized teenage girls in residential care. So I'm very grateful to her that she encouraged me to find my way through it.
That's a pretty powerful question, isn't it? If not you, who? When you've already been struck so powerfully by the help that these girls needed. Gosh, that sounds even more stressful from my perspective, even more of a burden. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But obviously you found your way through, and it's become something that you now do as a regular part of your work, as I understand it.
It is. So I'm still, all these years later, I'm still teaching to these traumatized teenage girls in residential care. And then I'm also teaching in mainstream studios and have done teaching at the Veterans Administration and also in some other settings to refugees and asylum seekers and to some humanitarians. So yeah, really, really kind of a broad spectrum.
Well, maybe because trauma has become something that we talk about now, and phrases like PTSD and triggered have started popping into regular conversation. You'll hear people say things like, I've still got PTSD from the end of season sale at such and such. They're almost so talked about now that I think we're sort of losing sight of what trauma actually is, what the clinical definition is. So maybe you could outline for us the difference between traumatic stress and just general life stress, the sort of stuff that comes up for most of us through the course of our days.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make that distinction. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people use the word trauma kind of colloquially, casually, denote any kind of difficulty. And so it is really important to differentiate between expectable kind of life stress, like a job change or a child or a marriage or a divorce, and traumatic stress. So traumatic stress really involves being exposed to life-threatening stressors that overwhelm one's ability to cope and create really a sense of helplessness. And so some of those like life-threatening stressors could be things like war, it could be domestic violence, sexual or physical abuse, racist abuse, natural disasters, medical emergencies. And certainly, COVID has also been really a traumatic stressor, given the amount of death and really near-death experiences that it's created for people.
You said in the course, and it just blew my mind, that up to 90% of people will be exposed to some kind of traumatic stressor through the course of their lives. And when you rattle through that list, it does start to add up. I mean, I'm unlikely to be close to a war, knock on wood, here at the bottom of the South Island, but, natural disasters. And you mentioned the pandemic too. So what kind of stress events have the pandemic brought up for people?
Yeah, the pandemic, I was just looking at what the most recent figures were. And just a few weeks ago, the most recent figures indicated that approximately 1 million Americans now have died from COVID.
I mean, that's
And
such a huge number. It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
it's a mind-boggling number. And there's some research that suggests for each of those Americans that died from COVID, they leave behind 9 bereaved persons, so close family or friends. And there's emerging research that says about 30% of loved ones left behind from a COVID death will go on to develop PTSD, actually. So that number is huge. So
That's
just
higher than the general, the statistics offered in the course were somewhere between 8 and 20. So why do you think COVID specifically is leading to a higher incidence of PTSD?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I'm not totally sure, and I don't know if anyone has identified it, but I wonder if it's just been the overwhelming, unpredictable nature of this illness, and that it was, so many people were so fearful for their well-being. But you're right, that is higher than the kind of 8 to 20% that we usually think about getting traumatized by a traumatic event.
And I wonder if some of it's just around expectation too. If floods happen, if wildfires happen, everyone's on the same page about how terrifying this thing is. But COVID has really divided people's perceptions. Is it just a cold? Is it a hoax? Is it no big deal? Is this a life-threatening global pandemic? So there's been that sort of that lack of expectation that serious outcomes could evolve.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that probably contributes to how traumatic it is, because people don't expect that, oh, for me, this is might be the end of my life.
Yeah. And then for a lot of people having to experience that by themselves without family members around, in isolation in medical care, or for the family members not being able to see them, I can imagine that being really challenging too.
Oh, absolutely. The way that we respond to trauma really impacts on the traumatic imprint that it leaves. So if someone's in a very traumatic situation, so for example, COVID, but they were able to have their loved one there during a hospitalization, holding their hand, soothing them, helping them find their way through it, they'd be less likely to be traumatized than someone who didn't receive that kind of care.
And it's so obvious when you say it, and I imagine myself in that scenario, it's so obvious, but I think sometimes we think of our bodies and minds as a little bit like machines, and we forget that they're not really machines. They're swimming in a sea of chemicals that is completely influenced by our perception of our experience and our feeling of being in it with somebody versus being in it by ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, we know actually that social engagement is one thing that we can use to regulate our nervous systems. That's one of the things we talk about in the course, that really through really attuned, responsive social engagement, that's one of the things that can bring us back into a level of calm arousal, out of a fight or flight or a freeze state. So that's really, it's really crucial.
And fortunately, we do often see that in traumatic incidents. There's horrible things, but you also see a lot of examples of human beings rallying together, pulling together and doing extraordinary things to help and support each other. Thank goodness. Right. So there is some of that instinct in us to seek each other out and to help each other through really difficult times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a real protective factor for sure.
Yeah. And what about healthcare workers through the pandemic? I imagine they were really at the coalface, seeing it in all its horror.
Absolutely. And the emerging research says that really 30% of the medical personnel on the front lines are also developing PTSD. And as a psychologist in my practice, I work with a lot of nurses actually who are on the front lines. And it's been very traumatizing to them, because not only were they feeling helpless, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, to really aid their patients, to save their patients, but they are also putting their own lives on the line every single day when they went into work before we had the vaccine. So that's been really quite traumatizing too. Yeah. To that group of people.
I can almost imagine it being like, on a previous podcast, I spoke to Edding Vlongo, who's an anesthesiologist, and she was giving me her experience of intubating people through the pandemic. And I was struck then, as I was struck now, when you were talking about the nurses, that we were having these parallel experiences, that I was safe and sound at the bottom of New Zealand, nothing particularly terrifying happening here, just working and doing jigsaw puzzles. And meanwhile, people are going to work every day, wondering if this will be the day that they get sick and die, or if this will be the day that they take the virus home to their families. And I can imagine that weirdness being an extra layer of trauma for them, that not everybody's having the experience that they're having. Even your next door neighbor's not having the same experience that you're having of this pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the pieces that was especially hard for some of my nurses, for example, to bear, this feeling that other people didn't understand how they were really confronting death every day. Even here in the States, where there was a lot of COVID, the average person couldn't really grasp what they were having to cope with all the time.
Wow, that sounds really challenging. And many of our listeners are yoga teachers, or at least serious, dedicated yoga students. But I imagine most of us don't teach trauma-informed yoga. We teach a general population. But with everything that you said, we can probably assume that a couple of the people in our class, if we're teaching a community class, will have experienced traumatic life events and may also have some form of PTSD or some semblance of that trauma in their bodies. So I think even for those of us who don't teach to the kinds of populations that you spoke about in veterans care or refugee centers or in clinical settings, it's probably helpful for us all to have some foundational knowledge of how trauma changes the brain and body. So let's start there by talking about some of the ways that trauma can disrupt the brain and the body. And you'll do the talking because I don't know.
We really know that trauma has really far-reaching effects, right, on the brain and the body and the nervous system. And it would take many days for us to catalog all of the changes that occur. And I think maybe what's most useful is for us to focus in on one particular area, to really focus in on how it dysregulates the autonomic nervous system. It's this part of the nervous system, that takes care of all the automatic things that our body needs, like heart rate and breath, but is also responsible for initiating self-protective action. And its kind of interface with the world determines how we experience our way of being, whether we feel like we're in safety or in danger. And what we really know from a lot of studies is that due to trauma, the autonomic nervous system gets really dysregulated. So there are these really, I think, 3 parts, and stop me if this is getting too much in the weeds.
We love the weeds in the Yoga Medicine podcast. Go right into those weeds.
Okay. So there are really these 3 parts of the autonomic nervous system. Most of us, I think, have been trained to think about just the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. I think it's really useful to look at really polyvagal theory that really divides the parasympathetic nervous system into 2, really talks about, look, this is really two different parts of the system. So we have the sympathetic nervous system that's responsible for initiating fight or flight. We know that gets overactivated by trauma. We're more likely to be quickly triggered into feeling like we're in danger and then to either run away or to fight. The parasympathetic nervous system has these 2 pieces. There's the ventral vagal complex, essentially, and the dorsal vagal complex. The ventral vagal part of the parasympathetic nervous system is associated with calm arousal, associated with what we've traditionally talked about as the rest and restore response. Trauma actually underactivates that part of the nervous system. So it's really hard if you have a history of trauma just to find your way into a state of just kind of calm alertness where you can be socially engaged with others. And then the last part of this in the polyvagal theory is the dorsal vagal part of the nervous system. And that initiates essentially the freeze response. When you're unable to outrun or outfight a threat, then the way your body protects you is to shut you down completely, kind of like playing possum. And so in these states, there's a kind of freeze, and we get dissociative, we get numbed out, we're really not present. And we know that also gets unpredictably activated when we have a history of trauma.
I think that's so important for people to understand, because you're right. We're really familiar with the sort of stress response and relaxation response. And if I were teaching a room of people and I saw someone whose eyes were looking around and maybe they were clenching their fist or their jaw, I'd be thinking, oh, this person is tense. This person is stressed out. But the person who's disassociated, I might just think they've checked out. I might just think, maybe they're thinking about their shopping list or they're daydreaming. I wouldn't necessarily have perceived that as somebody who's in a similar state of physiologic stress as the person who's clenching their fist or clenching their teeth. And it brings to my mind why so often we hear stories of, oh, why didn't they fight back, or why didn't they run away? We don't know enough, I think, about this freeze response in the general population to understand that can be one of the body's mechanisms to try to keep us safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can be such a great source of shame for people who've experienced trauma, who've been in a freeze and they were unable to fight back. And so it can be tremendously comforting for people to know, look, this was your body's way of keeping you safe. And oftentimes there are situations when it would be more dangerous to try to fight back or to flee. And so this is the best option when there's an overwhelming stressor that we can't combat. And you're right, it's something that's much more subtle. And I think a lot of people miss it. Really being able to detect that in our students, detect that in our clients is really important and really helpful.
And I think anyone who practices yoga who has heard you talk about those responses has an instinctive feeling that, oh, I can think of some ways that yoga would help, because we've all experienced some level of stress. And we've all experienced some level of checking out. And of course, these are much bigger off the ends of the spectrum, but we still have that feeling of, like you had when you went to yoga practice, oh, it made you feel better. It helped you to regulate the state of your nervous system. We've all experienced that. But maybe you could take us through a little more specifically the ways that yoga can help with those dysregulated states.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's been some really big studies, that meta-analyses that have taken a look at what are the specific kind of healing elements in yoga that can help shift the dysregulated nervous system. And what they have tend to find is that mindfulness, breathing practices, and certain movement practices can really be helpful. And what they've found is that these practices can help dampen the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So it dampens the fight or flight response, that it tends to bring the ventral vagal complex back online. So it's easier to access states of calm, awareness, relaxation, and also that it dampens down the kind of unpredictable activation of the dorsal vagal. So we're less triggered into these hypo-aroused or numb dissociative states.
Those are pretty broad descriptions, though. I mean, mindfulness, you think about breathing practices that could run the gamut from Bhastrika, the bellows breath, to simple breath awareness or Ujjayi breathing. And then movement practices could be everything from Shavasana to camel pose to a handstand. So those are really big baskets to draw from. And I imagine some options are going to work better for traumatized students than others.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Not just any breath practice, not just any movement practice is going to be regulating. But what studies have found is that breathing slow breathing, resistance breathing, like an Ujjayi breath, or like if you're chanting, that's another kind of resistance breath that would be useful. Breathing in and out through the nose is going to be calming. Deepening the breath, expanding the breath wide is also really useful. We really wouldn't want to do a lot of breath retentions or like rapid breathing in and out through the mouth. So those are things that really could trigger dysregulation in our students. So that those aren't breath practices I would recommend.
Oh, yeah, carry on. We were going to talk about the movement practices. And what I loved in the course is that, because I think subconsciously, I always think about the social media headline, these 3 poses for trauma use, these 3 poses for traumatized students. And it's rarely that simple, is it? And in the course, you really stress that it's about the quality of the movement and not about the shapes specifically that you take.
Yeah, I absolutely really strongly believe that. Yeah, I don't think there's any one magical pose that's going to heal someone. I think it's all about, how we're moving. It's about typically slow, mindful movement. It's about how we relate to the movement, right? And so it's also about not muscling our way through, but continually also giving ourselves choice. How do I feel now? How do I want to respond to what's here now? So I think that's really important.
I do too. And I think the same with really any challenge that I'm trying to manage with a yoga practice, whether it's a physical injury or a mental or emotional challenge. It really is less about the thing, and it's much more about the way that you approach it. Because for some people, maybe handstand training is exactly the precision and the focus and the physical challenge that they need, and for somebody else it's a restorative version of child's pose. But I do think in the back of my mind, we sort of think people who are hurting, people who have experienced these disruptions, put them in restorative and it will be perfect. And that might be true for some people some of the time, but I imagine for other people, just being quiet and still for a few minutes could be hugely challenging.
Yeah, that can really be hugely triggering, actually, is what I've found, that it's hard to be really, really still and really quiet if you have a lot of unresolved trauma. I mean, I would say typically that's the case. When people get really quiet, then everything that's there, sometimes that's when it will flare up, right?
Totally, because your brain's got space to look back into the past and project forward into the future. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, definitely. So I think for me, and in terms of the experience I've had with all of my clients, I really think that that's a more advanced practice or restorative practice for a lot of people if you have a history of trauma.
And even when you don't, honestly, I think that is a more advanced practice. To find your way very quickly to stillness is something that a lot of our nervous systems they're just not ready for. We do operate fairly heightened much of the day. It takes time to kind of bring ourselves down to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So to really work then with more slow, mindful, intentional movement, I think is something that most people can better tolerate. And I think it's always really important for us not to speak in terms that are too black or white. I always like to really encourage people to notice, how do you feel? How does this practice feel in your body? What do you need? And that's so important, especially with trauma, because for people who end up being traumatized, usually they've been prevented from taking self-protective action in the moment, at the moment of trauma, right? And so we want to really encourage a sense of agency that in and of itself can be healing, to feel like I can impact how I feel, what I do.
Yeah. And I think that's an approach I use when I teach anyway, not suspecting that there could be traumatized individuals in the class, but just because to me, that is really the point of the practice, is to get that into that kind of exploration. So the teacher has just said that back bends are thought to be stimulating and energizing. Let's see if that's true for me. Is that true for me today? Is that not true for me today? And taking the brain into the body, to me, is really the point of the practice for everyone, no matter what they've brought to the yoga mat with them.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that is the practice, right? That curiosity. What's here now? How does this feel now? And that's, part of what we really want to inspire in a really mindful, trauma-informed yoga practice. One of the things that we know is that when you have a history of trauma, when there's a lot of arousal, dysregulation, the observing mind, the thinking mind, the medial prefrontal cortex goes offline. So it's harder for us to just observe clearly, think clearly. And so that's part of what we're teaching people and practicing, right? Notice what's here now. How do you feel now? To really encourage that kind of watchtower to come back online.
Yeah. And that in itself creates space between those unpredictable stimuli, those unpredictable triggers, and the response. Like, oh, where did that come from?
Right.
Mm.
I love that. It triggers space, and then that space allows for choice, right? And
Yeah.
that's like the essence of the practice. And that's what's really helpful for people then off the mat if they've been doing a trauma informed practice, is to start to bring that awareness into their daily lives and recognize, for example, when they're triggered, when there's been a traumatic trigger, and to have enough awareness that they can realize I'm triggered, and then to use a breath or a movement practice to come back into a space of calm alertness.
Now, a lot of the things that you suggest as guidelines for mindful trauma informed yoga, to me, just make good sense for regular classes. So having that sort of curiosity in our practice, notice what's coming up now and make space for it. Options, anything that's not feeling right for you for any reason at all, take what I'm saying as a suggestion. You don't need to do everything. You can stop, you can take a break, you can add things in, you can leave things out. That, I think, is just good, sensible teaching.
Yeah.
And giving people tools that they aren't just employing on the yoga mat, but off the yoga mat. That is also, to me, just normal, sensible teaching. But there are definitely some aspects to trauma-informed teaching that were a little counterintuitive for me. And one of them was when you were speaking about teenage population specifically, having them, or even adults in clinical settings, having them verbally check in at the beginning of practice to tell you how they're feeling, and verbally at the end of practice tell you whether anything had changed. And that for me sounds kind of stressful. But is it because they've got this sort of shared relationship in a clinical setting of this small group of people that they know to some extent?
Yeah, I would say like that isn't a practice that I would recommend in a mainstream yoga setting where you don't know, what someone's history is. But like, for example, if I'm at the VA or I'm at the residential center with the teens, they all know that they're there and that they all have a history of trauma and are working on that together. And the purpose of really having them verbalize is to really enhance the mindfulness. It's one thing to tell people, I think, to say, okay, just notice, what feeling state is here, what's going on with your breath, what sensation is here. It's another thing to really make them identify. And so more than anything, it's a way just to teach mindful observing without judgment, what's here now, this moment.
That makes so much sense to me, because I've had the same experience with students. If I'll give them a practice for a physical injury or recovery, and I'll say, how does that feel? They'll say, fine. I'm like, no. More information than that. Go back, look again. Tell me the quality of the sensation. Show me where you feel it. Tell me about the intensity of the sensation. So having them reassess and put kind of clarity around that experience.
Yeah, definitely. That's what we want, that clarity, and bringing that part of the brain back online, right? The kind of watchtower. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to take care of what's here if we're not even aware of what's here. So we want to really inspire that awareness. It's so important.
And then one of the other things that came up that surprised me was having music as kind of safe white noise in the background, so that there isn't that weighty silence that could bring up memories. I guess I had thought it might be the other way, that music could trigger memories or trigger thoughts of people, because it, to me, gets straight to the sort of emotional center. If I hear a song that I was listening to as a kid, it just takes me straight back there, for example.
Yeah. I think it's really preferable to use music without words. And so not to be necessarily playing like a lot of popular songs, but we really do know that music of a certain tempo can really be yet another kind of sensory input that can help calm the nervous system. And I have really found that it's been so useful to people with robust histories of trauma to have this additional input to try to bring them more robustly into the present.
That makes sense to me. And then there are others that I think are kind of logical, like don't switch the lights off and have people in the dark, don't walk around the room and touch people from behind. Again, that just sounds sensible to me. I wouldn't do that to regular students. So it was a really interesting practice going through the training and kind of thinking which practices were expected, which were things that I do already, and which would have required me to change. definitely one of the ones that would have required me to change was the teacher having a calm demeanor. I'm pretty expressive. I don't have a good game face. So I imagine if I were working with traumatized populations, I'd have to dial things way back.
Well, I think authenticity is really important. So, and I think that people who have histories of trauma, especially of interpersonal violence, they're hyper attuned to the people across from them and if what they're getting is authentic or not. So
Robot Rachel might not be a successful trauma-informed yoga teacher. Fair enough.
Yeah,
that's
so
good.
Important, I guess, for me to kind of titrate that message a little too then.
Yeah. Well, I guess nobody wants to be taught by Robot Rachel anyway. One of the things that you said in the course that really struck me was a willingness to breathe is a willingness to feel. And that's so true. I think anyone who's been in a yoga practice knows that feeling of getting quiet, dialing into their own experience. And we say this kind of offhand at the beginning of practice, notice that you're breathing in, notice that you're breathing out, but really feeling those physical sensations, feeling the breath arrive and depart is a level of sensitivity that I presume not all traumatized students are ready for. So what are some things that we as teachers might inadvertently do or say that could re-traumatize our students or bring them into a place where they're having experiences that we as teachers aren't equipped to help them with?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A number of things, some of them we already touched on, and that is that we always want to remind our students that they're in control and that we're going to suggest a number of things and they're welcome to decide if they want to participate or not and to rejoin us when they're ready. I think that's really important. Sometimes, for example, if you see someone who looks, there's a number of things you can do. If you see someone who looks really unpredictably triggered, for example, through being in a short shavasana, I would even in the midst of it encourage that person to sit up. So you want to be really attuned to nonverbal signs of distress. And sometimes people will let you know verbally after class if they're feeling overwhelmed. And that's why I think it's really important if you're working in a clinical setting in particular to make sure that you're really partnering with the professionals there. So you can figure out, okay, how can we help this person who's feeling really quite triggered right now, get through the evening or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think comes up as for anyone who's started to teach. I think you go into teaching a lot more certain about things that you become as the years go on. I have definitely found that people are surprising, people are unpredictable, and the things that feel 100% true for me in my bones just aren't true for other people all of the time. So the longer I've taught, the more space I've created around which things are likely to be challenging or which things are likely to be triggering, because, you just don't know what people's histories are.
Right. And I think maybe that's one of the most important pieces to bring as a teacher, right? This open awareness, this kind of curiosity about, okay, what is the experience of those around me, knowing that we can't assume everyone is going to take things in the same way. Then I think that enables us to really identify when someone is struggling or having a different experience.
Yeah. And then just reminding them that they're in charge. They have choices. They could come out, they could take a different shape, take a different practice. And I suppose as people continue practicing, they start to build a range of things in their toolkit. Like I know I like this breath, so I might just sit and do this breath. It usually makes me feel more calm.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, that's fascinating. I think you've covered a lot of territory that for me as a teacher is really interesting, but I imagine even for people practicing in yoga classes, just taking a moment to look around the room and think, you have no idea what the rest of the people in this room are going through. And even if they're not nurses, early on in a pandemic, they could still be fighting some battle that you're not aware of, that you won't see. And that in itself might remind us to bring a little bit more compassion to our interactions with people, because you never really know what they've been through or what they're going through now.
Yeah, you never really know. And that's beautiful. That's especially important to remember right now, I think, during this time, right, with still so much stress from COVID and so much racial stress. And, there's all the interpersonal violence that's taking place all the time.
Yeah, kindness and curiosity, I think, are the superpowers that we've kind of talked around in today's discussion. Curiosity for all of us, and then just compassion with ourselves as well as with those around us.
Definitely.
So you have a couple of courses that you've offered for yoga medicine. There's the 20-hour mindful trauma-informed yoga that really dives into the details of the what and the how and the why. But there's also a short 2-hour introduction, which does a bit of context and then gets straight to the point of here are some things that you want to bear in mind. So I would highly recommend both of those courses to anyone who teaches or practices and wants to know a little bit more context around how they could be more sensitive to trauma and more informed about it. Where else would you send people who are curious about you and what you do?
Where else would I send people?
You're pretty quiet on social media, so I certainly couldn't do my usual creepy deep dive on social media.
Yeah.
You're a small footprint.
Yeah, small footprint, probably the best place if you want to know more about what I do professionally is just looking on LinkedIn. Otherwise, I have been very quiet on social media, preferring to take a backseat as I'm, a psychologist primarily, and like to be a little more neutral in that way.
Very sensible. Well, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for the clarity and the thought and the care that you put into the information that you've shared with us here and also in those courses. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.